Thank you, Laura, for that reading. In the Gospels, one of Christ's most controversial acts is to heal people on the Sabbath. The seventh day of the week was holy to the Jews. It was a day when nothing was supposed to be done except go to synagogue and then go home and have a meal that was all of which of the food was prepared the day before. In the story of creation, the 7 days of creation, God created on the first 6 days, and then on the seventh day, God rested and commanded human beings to do the same. So the Jews took doing nothing very, very seriously on the Sabbath day. So Jesus knows that he is going to provoke some strong reactions when he sits down to dinner with a bunch of Pharisees by doing a healing in their midst on a Sabbath day. The Pharisees consider themselves to be the most conscientious Jews of all. They are the ones who are more orthodox than even the priests in Jerusalem. And so they think, above all others, that nothing should be done on a Sabbath day. And yet there's Jesus in the midst of them at this dinner party, healing a man who has great swelling and has been suffering greatly. Now, these Pharisees are good hosts. They abide by the rules, and that includes the rules of politeness, which means that you don't vocally criticize a dinner guest. So they keep their counsel. But Jesus knows what's on their minds, and they know what's on their minds, and they're thinking, that should not have happened today on the Sabbath. But Jesus reminds them that instinctively they know better than to insist that nothing happened on a Sabbath. And he tells them, if one of your oxen or a child fell into a well on the Sabbath, of course you would go and rescue them. You know you would do that. Children and animals alike back then were basically considered property for the person of a household. So if something you owned fell into the well and was in danger, you would go get it on the Sabbath. You know that. Now, Jesus is God's son. He acts on behalf of God, and so he considers any human being to be one of his own, just as much of kind of property, if you want to look at it that way, as an oxen or a child is to one of the Pharisees on a Sabbath day should they fall into a well. He looks upon this man who is sick and he says, of course I'm going to heal him. He is one of God's people. I'm going to heal him even if it's on the Sabbath day. Jesus is gently reminding them in making this comparison that the Pharisees have actually made two mistakes. One is that they're being far too narrow in their definition of the Sabbath rules, since they themselves will break them to save an oxen or a child who belongs to them. And secondly, the second mistake they've made is that they haven't fully recognized who Jesus is. They don't recognize who's actually having dinner with them. And so he's chiding them about this. You should know better. You of all people should know better. You've been waiting for me. You should know who I am. And to drive the point home, Jesus tells this parable about a wedding feast. Now, back in the first century in Palestine, when a wedding was held, everybody in the village was invited. Absolutely everybody, rich and poor, all invited. So the powerful and the powerless would both be present at the wedding. And as there are with weddings today, and we had a couple of weddings in the congregation this weekend, there's a head table, right? There's the place where the important people of the day are sitting. And the host of the wedding can choose who gets to sit at that table. And Jesus says, be careful. If you assume that you are one of the important people and just run up to that head table and sit down like you deserve to be there, the host may disagree. The host may see someone walk in who he considers to be more important to you, more important than you, someone of greater authority. And he may ask you to get up and get out of that chair at the host table and move down through the room a most humiliating walk down, while the person of greater authority moves up and sits at the head table. The parable is told to politely chide the Pharisees for their arrogance. In the parable, Jesus warns individuals against assuming that they're the most important person in the room. That's not your call, Jesus is saying. The host will decide who's the most important person in the room. You shouldn't be deciding it for yourself. And then he also tells the parable to remind all of the Pharisees at this dinner that he is sitting at that you have collectively been arrogant in assuming that you know the rules of the Sabbath better than I do. Jesus is warning against the perils of personal arrogance and what we would call institutional arrogance. In the past few years, Canada has been rocked by cases of institutional and personal arrogance, particularly in the last 12 months. One recent example comes from the Hockey Canada scandal. We've learned that the organization was keeping a slush fund for paying sexual assault settlements for their hockey players, particularly the ones who were in the juniors. In multiple cases, individual players in the juniors at away games, as well as groups of them, have been accused of sexual assault, rape, and sometimes gang rape. And these acts were being covered up and paid for by the top brass of Hockey Canada. Hockey Canada was using funds set aside to pay for settlements with the women who were the victims of these assaults. Parents who pay dues to Hockey Canada so their kids can play hockey in this country have been shocked, and rightfully so, to find out that their dues so that their kids can play hockey in the local rinks have been going towards basically hush-up settlements with women who have been raped by hockey players who are part of Hockey Canada. In our country, hockey players are heroes, and they know it. Their prowess in the sport earns them reverence, which they can leverage off the ice when seducing women. It appears that these players felt above the law, forcing women into unwanted sexual encounters. That personal arrogance has been backed up and probably reinforced by Hockey Canada's institutional arrogance of being willing to pay their settlements for them and keep it all hush-hush. They have acted as though they deserve to be at the front, at the best place at the dinner party. Now, churches are no strangers to this kind of arrogance, of course. 20 years ago, the public learned that the Catholic Church had been employing priests who have sexually assaulted congregants and children. They knew about the assaults, kept them secret, and then moved the priests to other parishes where they could do the same thing all over again. Priests have been quietly moved, their criminal behavior continued, and lately it's become clear that the same sort of pattern of behavior is also present in Protestant denominations. In the United States, their largest denomination of Protestants is the Southern Baptist Convention, and they're wrestling with their own raft of sexual abuse scandals right now. Closer to home, here in Hamilton, the leader of a Protestant megachurch has been found to have had inappropriate sexual relationships with congregants. All of these scandals are rooted in the kinds of arrogance that Jesus is talking about in today's scripture reading. The first is the arrogance of thinking that your social status entitles you to the most important place in the room. And the second is the institutional arrogance that assumes that your group knows better than anyone else, so if you want to cover it up, that's fine. You'd rather maintain the reputation of your institution than actually deal with the true consequences of what's going on. There's been a seismic shift in our attitudes towards sexual assault in the last few years thanks to the Me Too movement. Up until that movement came along, most hierarchical organizations like Hollywood studios and corporations thought that they could get away with covering up sexual assault allegations. For centuries, schools and corporations have been based on strict hierarchies, like the relationship of bosses with secretaries and teachers with students. There was no question who was most important in those dyads and who could exercise sexual coercion if they wanted to. In 2019, just before the pandemic sent us all home, in 2019, 25% of Canadian women experienced sexual coercion at work. That could be sexual harassment as well as sexual violence in a physical sense. Long-term studies have found that 8% of all rapes occur at work. And it's safe to assume that sexual coercion and assault were even more common in past decades and centuries than they are now. These hierarchical organizations have always given men the power to exercise sexual coercion, and women have had little power to resist or even to complain. Up until recently, most women stayed quiet, or if they did go and complain to their organization, their HR departments often told them to just stay quiet. Don't make a fuss. And if you do make a fuss, we'll make a choice. And usually the choice was to keep the male boss and let the female employee drift away. Reverend John Suk, my predecessor here, once made the point that the difference between churches and other institutions is that you can choose to leave church. Businesses, churches, and schools have always been places where sexism and sexual coercion have been exercised. But we don't feel like we should just give up watching sports or stop buying products or stop going to the movies when we hear that sexual coercion is a consistent part of those organizations. But we can choose to leave church, and people do. When they hear about sexual assault within churches, people go, "Oh, that's it. I don't want anything to do with the churches." And that's understandable, but we should recognize that we don't do the same thing with other institutions in our society where these problems are also prevalent. Every time another priest or evangelical pastor is identified as having engaged in sexual assault, the reputation of Christianity as a whole takes another hit. So why do people leave church in response to sexual abuse allegations and actual actions, but not corporations or boycott the movies? The big difference is that Christianity is founded on a principle of love and care for the most vulnerable. When church leaders exploit the vulnerable, they are exposed not just as predators, but as hypocrites. Their crimes may be the same as the boss in the office with the door closed, but the meaning of it is different. Ministers are supposed to protect the vulnerable, not prey on them. And that is a fair and just expectation. Christ calls on ministers to not assume that they're the most important person in the room, but to be humble and to take the least important seat. Yet in practice, ministers often become intoxicated with self-importance and institutional power. Adulation and influence tends to encourage arrogance and self-importance, which for some translates into a sense of sexual license with congregants. The forces of sexism and patriarchy which inspire male sexual violence can be found in every corner of our society, and the battle to defeat these forces is going to take a long time. And they won't go down without a fight, many fights. If you watched any of the social media reaction to the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, you know that even before there was a verdict, the public, or at least the bots on social media, had made their decision that Johnny Depp was being mistreated and slandered by Amber Heard, even though she never mentioned his name in the article that she was being sued for. That was patriarchy fighting back, saying enough. Our calling in the church is always to be on the side of the vulnerable and to recognize that our church authorities are called to be humble and not arrogant. And that may mean a radical change in the way church is conducted going forward. Our reputation and authority has been so tarnished by these scandals and revelations that regaining people's trust will take a lot of effort and a lot of humility. We can no longer believe that saying we are the church will hold much sway in the arguments we make, even when we're talking about things like social justice. Fancy buildings and fancy costumes feel like they're part of the problem of the arrogance that got us here. In today's reading, after Christ tells the parable of the wedding, he says one more thing to the leader of the dinner party, the host of the dinner party that he's attending. And that man is the head of the local Pharisees. He reminds them that in the wedding parable, he'd said it was better for a Pharisee to sit at the back than at the front, lest they be moved backwards. It'd be better to be called up by the host of the wedding. But that idea of being called up might make a Pharisee's ego go, ooh, I hope I'm the one that they call up. And if they do get called up to the front, they might go, they recognized who I really am. And that is not humility. That's just egotistical self-absorption, another form of arrogance. So, having told this parable about the prospect of someone being invited up to the front, Christ provides a coda. He provides one more little story. And he says to the Pharisee who's hosting the dinner party, the next time you have a dinner, don't invite any of your friends. Don't invite any of your fellow Pharisees. Don't invite any family members. Because if you do, they may just invite you to the next dinner party they have, in which case you're just trading favors. No, if you really want to be walking in God's way, the next time you, lead Pharisee, hold a dinner party, invite the people who are rejected by Orthodox Jewish religion. Invite the people who don't get into the temple. Invite those who are blind, those who have problems with their legs, people who are disabled, people with skin diseases, people who, according to the rules of that time, were considered ritually unclean. Invite them to dinner. They won't be able to pay you back, but you will be repaid by God in the end, because God will see that you are walking in God's path. Earlier, we heard about how at dinners there's a pecking order where the most important people sit next to the host. But Christ is telling this leader of the Pharisees, you should host dinner parties where there is no hierarchy. No jostling for position, no person more important than the other. Christ's mission on earth is to help us see how to arrange ourselves and our society so it would be more like the feast that God would host. One where everyone is invited and no one is more important than anyone else. Jesus is suggesting that there's something even better than being at the head of the table. And that's when everyone is respected, even those, especially those who don't have any formal power. This may seem like a Sunday school truism, but Hockey Canada could have saved itself a lot of grief had it treated the women who were assaulted as equally important as their hockey players. They lost their place at the head of the table by ignoring the dignity of the people they thought were powerless and unimportant compared to their hockey players. And now they're paying for it. Churches and corporations alike put themselves and others at risk by embracing arrogance over respect. Jesus is pointing the way to a more stable, equitable, and ultimately more successful way of running organizations. One where the best seat is reserved for those who have proven their worth through humility and compassion for all. In our time, that means that institutions need to be transparent when employees misbehave. It also means that we have to respect and support whistleblowers when they come forward. If the top brass of an organization is not protecting the vulnerable and a whistleblower comes forward, they need to be protected from repercussions because they're the ones who are actually doing the right thing. Standing up for the rights and safety of the vulnerable should always be seen as a business best practice. I know that goes against the grain of the way businesses are run, but just ask the former chair of the board of Hockey Canada who had to step down because he ignored this principle. And now members of parliament and the Liberal government, federal government, are asking for the entire board to resign. They are being asked to leave the head table and move back. Jesus imagines a dinner party where no guest is more important than any other. And he encourages us to see that we are not here to impress other people, but to help serve the feast that God has provided for everyone. We are called to set aside arrogance for ourselves and our institutions and embrace compassion for each other. That will lead to a feast, a society worth having and worth attending. One where arrogance is outside, while fairness and respect take their place at the table. A feast where we all get a seat next to God, the host of this party, throne for all. Amen.